you. Yeah, yo. There whenever it matters, and even more when you feel like it doesn't. Protect you so you never feel like you wasn't. Know I'm right alongside you. Either that or I'm behind you, but always got you. End of discussion, nothing means more. First one to offer is shoulders for what you reach for. Thought I saw the eyes of the world until I seen yours. And know that I ain't see a better view yet. I'm with whatever, so don't ever you fret. Know that you covered, not a hurdle or a heartbreak. A change what a partake, cause none of them won't ever get comfortable in your walkway. My job is to aware you, fully loaded, prepare you for all of the above that I'm never letting get near you. But still in all, give you every advantage I found. Couldn't find a better fit for them, along with my crown. And since the baton was passed, I've been down. Cause failing's not an option, and dad is not a noun, not at all.
My message to any dad, man, first off, know that, yeah, it is a hard job, but it's the greatest job in the world. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I wouldn't change anything about it. Everything you're doing from here on out, if it didn't have purpose before, now it has purpose. It's the most important thing you'll ever do. Just be a dad.
Welcome to another episode of Dad Is Not a Noun. My name is Ishmael, changing the narrative for men of color fatherhood, as well as changing the narrative on the things I care about. Happy 2025. This is the new episode for the podcast for 2025. And I'm truly honored to have a special guest with me. He's my brother for almost 20 years, over 20 years. He's the co-founder and co-host of an amazing podcast called Jeek Nation. Mr. Magic, a.k.a. Matt, thank you for coming on, brother.
What's good, my dear brother Ish? Always a pleasure to be on live with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight.
Before we get in, dig deep into the conversation, all my guests, I'm all about mental health. This is 2025. The question I want to ask you, how's your heart at this moment?
Oh man, that's a good question. I would say I am, good. Trying to establish a new norm, since a major change in life from August that you're aware of. So. I'm just trying to really feel out where that new normal is, and really just adapt accordingly. But I am doing so with a grateful heart.
And that's good to hear. I'm always here for you. I'm always a phone call away, so you can always call me. You know how we go behind the scenes.
Yes.
Before we get into this conversation, I think it's important to highlight. Give me some of your wins in 2024.
Oof! Oh man, I really didn't have many 20 wins in 2024.
You gotta have some wins, bro.
Wow, man, 2024 was not a year of many wins. I would say that I did a decent job saving money. I did a decent job saving money. That's definitely a win. And being prepared to deal with unexpected crises, at least financial crises. That was good. So that was a win. Other than that, unfortunately, not a whole lot of wins in 2024, but looking forward to more in 2025.
Facts. And as a Black man, you're here for another year, so that's a win by itself right there too. So
Absolutely.
I want to just put that on the table for you, bro.
Yes, absolutely.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to dig into this great conversation. I hit you up and he's like, yo, this is dope. Let's do this. Last year, I had this conversation with the hip hop historian, Brother Lax, and we talked about the appropriation of MLK. And I think it's important to dive into this conversation again because there's a lot on the table that we didn't discuss last year that I
Okay.
want to add to the conversation today as we get ready to celebrate and honor the memory of MLK. One of the critical points of um, MLK Day is understanding behind the scenes and how behind the scenes wise it was something not as a goodwill, but as a way to change the narrative to dilute his message for um opportunistic reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great article from Marquette, and I sent you.
Yes.
And I think this kind of leads into the conversation that we're going to have. And it was by Denise M. Bostdorff and Stephen R. Goswig. And the article was the history collection memory and the appropriation of Martin Luther King and Reagan's rhetorical legacy. Um, I sent you the PDF file on it. What was your thoughts on that article?
Well, it's 27 pages long, so we can't call it an article.
right.
But
It's a paper.
it's a paper, a very well done paper, um, and it's a paper that I really appreciate because um, intellectually, it's something that we need to read because it, unlike a lot of things right now, when it comes to history, politics, anything, so much of what we hear now is opinion based and not facts based, with works cited and quotes and things to substantiate the point being made. This scholarly paper is not a piece of opinion. It is factual with the quotes and the information to reinforce the claims being made by the two authors. So, if anybody, if you haven't thought of it, I would recommend linking it, to this episode so that anybody that is listening can read it for themselves, especially if they want to re-listen to it, and with the aforementioned knowledge that they would occur in by reading it, I would definitely recommend it because it is worth the time to read the 27 pages. And if you don't have time to read it all, a healthy skim is a great start. It's honestly, this is getting saved into a folder I have, for that was shared with me that I copied, that just has all type of articles and papers like this, that was designed for Black intellectuals. This is going right in there with those other books and papers and articles that I have compiled that should be read and reread and discussed. It is it's well written and a non-biased piece of information.
No, I definitely agree. And one of the points that stuck out me the most, I actually have it up on the screen. You see it on the screen right now.
Yep.
And I think one of the things what they did was effectively when you talk about um, giving Dr. King a holiday was there was no need for civil rights protection because after the civil rights bill and other bills behind it, now the work is done. Now we can become a colorblind society. What was your thoughts on that part?
Well, that was the goal that they had, and unfortunately, I mean, you and I both know that that was never the true goal. The goal was to have the facade of a colorblind society, and then unfortunately, the they were successful in creating that, because you have, generations who are genuinely under the impression that we live in a colorblind society, or that things were trending towards a colorblind society, when that was never reality. And if it was something that people would claim to be reality, it was something that was not. That was a very small or individualized experience, and nowhere near an experience on a countrywide or massive level.
And also, I think what it did too was it, because again, people don't want to bring race in it, but you have to bring race in it, because what it did was it kind of pushed that narrative of we don't need affirmative action anymore because it's taking jobs away from white males.
People don't want to bring race in it, but you can't. but you can't not bring race in it, because it's the reason why it's there. The reason, there's no separating race from it. And for the people who like to complain, oh, why I have to bring race into it? Well, from the jump, we collectively as Black people didn't bring race into anything. White people did. That's how they created the system. That's how they enforced the system. And we didn't say we're going to put race into this. This wasn't a creation of ours. We have to operate in the system as it is, because not enough people, I should say, I'm not going to say no one, but not enough people care enough to change that system. So until enough people care about changing that system, because they don't want to mind benefiting from it, even though they may say, oh, that's wrong. You're still benefiting from it, and obviously you don't care that much because you're not doing enough to make a change from it. So you can't, people that like to complain about race being brought into everything, you can't complain about that, because, well, that's how it was set up. That's how we have to navigate. And Dr. King being honored on a national level is strictly based upon his contributions to civil rights and the civil rights for Black people. There's no separating race from any discussion regarding Dr. King outside of the Black community. Within the Black community, there are other discussions that we have regarding Dr. King's decisions, strategies, things of that nature. But when we're talking about holiday narrative legacy, there's no separating race in any way, shape, form, or fashion.
And then also, I think it's important to add to the conversation is another strategy was to boost the individual when it comes to policy, and not hold government responsible when it comes to policies that impact the whole.
Right. So this country loves to accentuate individualism. This country loves to make everyone think that individualism is about you, your inalienable rights, your freedoms, when that's more of a smokescreen of anything. The country is a country. It's a collective. It's in a lot of ways it's an oligarch. But what the government does is not individually based. It is collective based. And it's always been that way. You can't have a government that is focused on the individual. It's an oxymoron. Because then everyone would have their own individual government and their own individual laws, and that's not how government works. So the focus is, and that's just the way the United States always puts their focus on everything. So why would they abstain from that when it comes to race, and how race impacts. Because if they can focus individually, then you can convince people who say, well, I haven't done anything racist, or I haven't seen my mom or my dad or my grandma or my grandpa do anything racist. So racism must not be a thing. Or, well, the town I grew up in, I didn't see any racism. Well, the town, and you'll see that posted on social media often. Well, the town that you grew up in, that was 98% white. You had one or two black kids in your school, and that you didn't even really know. Yeah, you didn't see any racism because one wasn't your, what happened to them. You didn't know them. They weren't your friends. They were somebody you happened to see in the hallway, and you weren't there seeing what they endured. But then, as a grown adult, you want to claim, "Oh, we just lived in this post-racial utopia where we were just people, and race didn't matter." That's in your mind. That's no one told you that. You assume that because you didn't see the racism of your forefathers. You didn't see, you weren't invited. You were not invited to a lynching. So because you weren't invited to a lynching, you're going to say racism is over. Because you didn't go to protest, black people sitting at the lunch counter, you want to say racism is over. You didn't, you didn't see black people getting hit, with being dog sicked on them or hit with water from fire hoses, or you don't remember black kids not being allowed to go to school with you. So in your mind, racism is over. That's not reality. And when you grow up and you have a quote unquote black holiday, and you have Black History Month, and you have these things that reinforce this thought in your mind that you live in a post-racial society, then you have people who will buy into that narrative because they haven't seen racism. They have there's a black holiday that quote unquote everybody celebrates, even though everybody doesn't. Looking at you, New Mexico. I'm sorry, looking at you, Arizona. We have Black History Month, and we've had a black president, so we must be in this post-racial society and then everyone wants to talk about Dr. King. Dr. King had the dream, and they want to quote the same quote that they all quote for Dr. King because it's the only thing they know regarding Dr. King, because from childhood, it's the only thing that they had been exposed to, because it's the same thing that's taught year after year after year, and to the point that it's not even true. I'll give a personal anecdote. When I was in high school in the 90s, I was a member of the newspaper staff at a predominantly white institution. And during Black History Month, this 99.9% white newspaper staff are writing articles regarding people in Black history. And I'm reading these articles, and they're not factual. Articles on Oprah, Malcolm X, Dr. King. And I'm reading these things, and I'm like, that's not true. And I'm like, have you read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Have you read things on Dr. King? Or are you going from your memory based on what you've been told about Dr. King, which is probably a paragraph's worth? Like and then you're putting this out there as fact, and then your fellow students are going to read this as fact, because as a newspaper, you're supposed to be objective and factual. So they're going to read it and accept it as fact, and that's going to do nothing but reinforce the extremely limited and narrative-driven information regarding Dr. King that has been programmed into them since, whenever they first started hearing about Dr. King, let's say second or third grade.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the collective memory.
Yes,
And that
which is
plays
something
a
we talked about
major-
offline. yes, the collective memory plays a major role, because now you have so many people sharing in this collective memory, which is a shade. As we said offline, it's almost a Mandela effect, because
Yes.
you have everybody remembering something that really truly didn't exist. Because just because it's something that's in their memory doesn't mean it took place that way, went that way.
Right.
Another personal anecdote: I had a former uh, so former acquaintance, um, whose podcast I had joined, say to me himself that he hadn't seen any racism while we were in high school together. And I said, well, that's too bad, because it happened. It happened to a black mutual friend of ours. And he's like, well, I don't understand. I didn't see it. I said, well, you didn't see it because you don't know what you're looking at. You didn't see it because you couldn't see it, and you weren't there every second. So I explained to him what the situation was. And he's like, oh, wow. Well, if I would have known about that, I would have said something. I said, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't have. But you are out here saying this person, you made the bold statement to say this person this black person we know that went to the same school we went to didn't experience racism. And I'm letting you know he did, because not only him, but him and his sister from the same school came to me for help to deal with that racism, because they knew that I had lived and gone through even more significantly harsher racism through my lifetime, and I would be able to help them guide through that, because they had not gone through as much as I had. I said they came to me for help. Why would they go to you, who don't even know what overt racism really even looks like? Why would they go to you? You don't know what you're looking at. How can you help with that? But because of the this collective memory, this myth that's been passed on and permeated through society, that everyone loves Dr. King and Dr. King's dream, and that we're in this post-racial society, they have this thought process that there's no racism. We're beyond that. And it's wild, because growing up, for especially for late Gen Xers, early millennials, a lot of us had parents who voted for Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan had a very high approval amongst black people during his two terms in office. Um, while and I understand, and I've talked um, to my elders who had voted for Ronald Reagan, and I understand the reasons why they did. And it helped me as an adult, having to make my own cast my own votes, and it's like, well, I really don't like any of these people, but I'm making a vote based upon rolling the dice on what I think would be ultimately best, for us moving forward, regardless of the misgivings I may have about this person, the misgivings I have about this person. And but we can't act like we didn't have a concern, because Coretta Scott King herself, and I believe in this article, actually the other article you sent me, Coretta Scott King herself said that she was concerned about Reagan being in office, and she said, and I quote, "Scared that if Ronald Reagan gets into office, we are going to see more of the Ku Klux Klan and a resurgence of the Nazi Party." Um, and as we know, and as things have been exposed over years, as we've gotten uh, archived audio of Ronald Reagan being openly racist, and obviously we've seen the effects of the war on drugs, and the policies that he put in place that negatively impact Black lives. We see that Mrs. King's fears were clearly not unwarranted. On top of the fact that he openly opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and called it a bad piece of legislation. And also he was also verbally against the Voting Rights Act. And I believe he said it was demeaning or humiliating or disrespectful to the South, something along those lines. So it's clear and on record that Ronald Reagan was not a fan of ours. Yet, in a true political move, he made signing this holiday into law was able to be a surface level of making himself to be an ally. And it's something that unfortunately so many people want to do nowadays and be in performative allyship. And that's essentially what Ronald Reagan accomplished by signing into law Dr. King's Day. It's the equivalent of these liberals wanting to wear blue bands to show that they're safe white people for us to be around. That blue band don't mean nothing. Just like that holiday ultimately doesn't mean much. We never asked for Dr. King's Day to become a holiday. I mean, it's a nice thing. That's not what we asked for. It's not improving Black lives. It's if anything, it's a day where racists show us how racist they are by talking bad about Dr. King, disparaging his memory by saying it shouldn't be a thing or whatever. And it's just it's a game that they played in politics because they did this, and I said yesterday to you, they did this with Italians to ingratiate Italians to accepting whiteness because Italians previously were not included in whiteness. They were othered. Creating the Columbus Day as a holiday was a way of ingratiating Italians into whiteness and making them feel better about their stock and their treatment within the country. And now, now Italians don't feel, that their overall mindset about the country is not what it used to be. It's much more favorable than what it used to be. So, and that it hasn't worked the same for us as it did for Italians, but it did have a similar effect for a lot of people, especially with these younger generations that have continued to be told that they're in this post-racial society. But as they are coming of age, they're starting to learn that is, truly, not the case.
No, definitely. And going back to that collective memory, that ties into when you talk about second generation of immigrants that came to the country in the 80s,
Right.
And so by doing what Reagan did so masterly is they distanced themselves from the civil rights movement, right?
Yes.
People don't realize without those policies put in place in the late 60s, that transition of coming to this country and being citizens, I wouldn't say was a smoother transition, but it made it a little bit more easier than it was before the civil rights policies put in place.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, there's a disconnect because, again, that collective memory of being a colorblind society makes people think I came to this country, I did it myself, I made a life for my family, and not to remember that there were people that were here that died, that were lynched, their homes were torched, to pave the way for all people that's minority that are thriving today are beneficial of those sacrifices.
Absolutely. It's funny because Dr. King, in one of his later interviews, mentioned the pulling up by the bootstraps, and he said it's a cruel jest to tell a man to pull a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps, where we'll have several people come from outside of the country. People immigrate either from Europe or from Asia, or from other parts of the world, who will quote unquote pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but in all actuality, they are not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, because when they come and they arrive, they are benefiting from the conditions of the country that the country is currently in. And those conditions would not exist without the Civil Rights era, without the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which directly led into a massive, I don't want to say importation, for lack of a better word, for influx of immigrants coming over to the country, especially those of, that are, non-white immigrants coming into the country. Now that things and laws have been established to protect them, to make things significantly easier for them to come and to thrive and to flourish. And those people came, and, they were kind of redlined into already redlined areas, and established businesses in black areas, and started to thrive. And then obviously there became tension from those situations as well. But as much as they want to say, hey, and they're not wrong by saying they came and they worked hard, and no one takes it away from them, but you didn't pull yourself up by your bootstrap. You came and started from a higher starting point than you would have had you came prior to the Civil Rights Act. As some of their, as as anyone who is who would have came during the Chinese Exclusion Act and things of that nature, those people came and they did not benefit from the Civil Rights era, where anyone who came after that, particularly like the Korean influx, benefited greatly post 1965. And it really is, it's really very tough, because as Black people in this country, we have collectively always done our best to care for the plights of others, because we understand plight, particularly because of our history in this country, and we have empathy for those people, and we have never been ones to not want others to succeed here.
Yes.
And sometimes that has been to our detriment. Unfortunately, it shouldn't have to be, but unfortunately, it's negatively impacted us in some ways. That other people have been able to advance where we haven't been. But even though that has been our detriment, one thing that I will say that I don't want that to change, only because at the heart of it, Dr. King, Malcolm, Medgar, or even Marcus Garvey would not have wanted us to tear them down to lift ourselves up. They all had different ideals, and some wanted us more separate, and other ideals, but none of them wanted us to tear down Asians, even other Europeans coming over and immigrating over to the country. They never wanted that. They just wanted what was right. They wanted reparation for what our forefathers had endured, and they just wanted equal treatment under the law, equal access to capital, so that we can continue to build and grow and thrive. And unfortunately, we are still fighting that same fight, and it's tough, because we're fighting a fight of shadows more now, because previously, prior to the civil rights movement, and what's part of the underhandedness of the narrative changing around Dr. King, is that now we are fighting a shadowy figure, a shadowy fight. It's not upfront, overt like it was for our forefathers back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Right. During pretty much from emancipation to 1965, it was a very in-your-face, overt fight. Now it is a very covert fight that we have to fight, and it's a very tough fight, because people now want to see proof that what is being said is racist, or that's not racist, that's and they don't, unless a person flat out says, yeah, I did this and I don't like them because they're black. They don't want to believe that there's a racial motivation behind whatever level of injustice currently occurs. And that's a very tough thing to do, and that's something that that the writers reference to, and when they talk about how Reagan's how Reagan essentially ascribed a new meaning to equal rights in his discourse and through his use of Dr. King's memory, and that just the level of harm that has caused is it's immense, because most of those people haven't read his letter from jail in Birmingham. They haven't heard his his speeches. They hear the clips that they want to listen to, and they act like the majority of what he said doesn't exist. They don't. Speaking of that former acquaintance I had, when I was on his show, I kind of shocked him when I told him, I said that that we really weren't fighting for integration. I told him, like, look, the majority of us, we were fine with separate but equal. It just wasn't equal. Because they love to put out this thought that Dr. King was so heavy on integration. Dr. King was heavy on integration because without integration, they weren't going to give us anywhere close to what we should get. But if it was actually separate and equal, we were cool. Like we were straight. Like, y'all don't want us around, okay, whatever, but just leave us alone to do our thing. But as you and I know, that wasn't the case. Because if that was the case, then Seneca Village wouldn't be Central Park now, and Lake Lanier, wouldn't be a lake now, and Rosewood would still be standing, and Greenwood would still be standing, and all the other black towns that got burned or turned into lakes would still be there if things were actually separate and equal.
No, and I think it's important too, when we go back to collective memory, is again another smart thing that was done is separate the civil rights movement from Reconstruction.
Right.
Like, Black people's plight started in the 40s and the 60s, but we don't talk about before the 40s, or dates predate the civil rights into Reconstruction. And so they're separate stories. They're not as a collective whole story. And so I find that I know that wasn't a part of the article about the paper, but from our conversation behind the scenes, I think that's a relevant conversation to have because of that, going back to that collective memory. Because when we have a conversation about that, it's separate. It's not as intertwined like it should be when we talk about race and equity and everything else in the sun.
Well, actually, and I'll encourage anybody, to, like I said earlier, to read it. They kind of do touch a bit about it, because they mentioned in Abraham Lincoln in the Forge of National Memory, which is a tie to that area, because Abraham, part of what was Reconstruction was starting to happen, prior to emancipation. The North was really heading towards the Reconstruction, industrial, factory-based era, and the South was still clinging on to the manual labor. So the country was already trending towards that. But I mean, the years of the years of sharecropping and all those things that transpired from 1865 to 1965, largely there's a large disconnect that's in the narrative, because they really like to focus on 1960 to 1965. They like to focus on what is so well put in the Fresh Prince of Bel Air, where and Viv tells in the episode where their friend Marge Marge shows up, the who's out there, still breaking into government buildings and burning documents. And she tells her, like, yeah, you're telling Will the romantic part of the struggle. You're not talking about the sit-ins and the petitions and fighting through the system, as well as trying to break the door down. Um, and they like to paint this narrative of all these, oh man, I want to call them. It's not. It's trauma. Um, eliciting emotional responses by reveling in the trauma and the trauma of the fire hoses and the marches and they revel in that and they continue to highlight that, but they only highlight it for that short period of time to set this narrative, and then they push it into the March on Washington, and then to the I Have a Dream speech, and that's where they cut it off, and that's where they stop. They only want to tell that particular part, and they like to leave it as this racism thing was a South problem, it wasn't a nationwide problem, and this guy was the guy who led us to look at the content of a person's heart and not the color of their skin, and boom, end of story. It's February is over. Now let's go back to the real, quote unquote, real history, which is more and more and more and more white people this. And that is how they successfully subverted Dr. King's memory. They subverted that memory for, for decades and decades. So almost 40 years now of subverting Dr. King's memory.
Facts, man. I know you gotta go, but this has been a dope conversation. We definitely have to do another part 2 of this conversation because I think this is important. And I want to say that MLK Day in its early stages, if you think about it, it was more, if you think about it nowadays, it was more of a PR stunt. That's what it was, and that's what it'll always be. And that's why I related to the whole situation with TikTok. Now TikTok is back and they're giving thanks to Trump. This was more of a PR start, a PR thing. So now he gets into office, TikTok's back, and people are gonna praise him because it was his leadership that led the charge of TikTok coming back. And I want people to not focus on TikTok, but actually focus on policies that's going to impact people's lives and follow that instead of what's going on with TikTok. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people benefit from TikTok, content creators, people who sell things. Yes, is valuable to a lot of people, but also remember there's policies that's on the table right now they're looking to cut, which will impact a lot of people's lives. So from this conversation we had today, it's important to know what they're doing. Don't listen to what they say. Actually look what they're actually doing. What policies are they putting in place that's going to have a hindrance impact on your lives? And my brother, Mr. Magic, Matt, thank you for coming on. How can people
Always.
find you?
You can find me Facebook, IG, Twitter, TikTok, Rockin' Mr. Magic, across all socials. That's Rockin' minus the G, MR for Mr. Magic, MAGIC. You can find Jeek Nation by searching to the JEEK Nation. Our podcast, Original Jeek Podcast, and others. Check us out. And my brother, always love you, appreciate you, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming on. And also people tomorrow or today, I recommend you to read that paper because I think if we're gonna celebrate okay, you definitely have to read this paper because you will definitely be informed. And we're out. Love you guys. Peace.